I'm Alana,
And I'm Jessie.
and we are making menches. Today is the second part of our four-part series on anti-Semitism, and we are going to be talking about what it means to grapple with anti-Semitism as Jewish people, from celebrities and peers. And we're just doing this in light of the onslaught of anti-Semitism that has found its way into the mainstream in recent months. Let's just jump into it.
I mean, we could recap all of the comments that have been made recently about Jews in an anti-Semitic way. There's some really good podcasts that have been talking about this in a much more nuanced way, specifically responding in the moment to Ye's comments and then Dave Chappelle's comments. And that's On the Nose, which is Jewish Currents podcast, which I
Okay, very
love.
cute.
Right? And they, just have a really good panel of people talking about it and breaking it down and pulling out specific quotes, and highly recommend people listening to that. And hilariously, when we planned this way before Dave Chappelle went on a 10-minute little monologue about Jews. So there's some really good takes in there, because I don't think the focus of our time is going to be breaking down those specific comments. But did you want to get into any more kind of explanation of why we are tackling this today?
Yeah, I'll get brief overviews of some of the more recent comments. Honestly, Dave Chappelle completely slipped my mind. I was like, oh yeah, these two very prominent people, Kyrie Irving and Kanye West, made these comments, and then there was another one. And if you want more detailed information on what happened and where these comments stem from, again, I'll shout out our source document that always gets sent out in our weekly newsletter, but we have a bunch of sources there that go more in depth on all of these events,
Yeah.
takes, all of this anti-Semitism. And so feel free to look there because, again, like Jesse said, that won't be the focus of our conversation. But I guess broad overview is, as I'm sure most of you know, in the last 2 months, Kyrie Irving basically shared this trailer for a movie, and I don't even know exactly what the movie is called, but it basically has a lot of Hebrew Israelite overtones throughout it, and a lot of the content of the movie is sort of perpetuating anti Semitic tropes because, as we talked about last time, a lot of the Hebrew Israelite ideology is about perpetuating anti Semitic tropes. And if you don't know who Kyrie Irving is, he's a basketball player on the Nets. He generally has some very cool radical takes and some also questionable takes around like the earth being flat and being anti-vax. That's a big one. So, he's already coming into the game with LOL, with some questionable takes. And I think a big part of this was, as we'll talk about later, the ways in which the organizations that he works for tried to hold him accountable, and I'm quoting those things, and how that played out. But we'll save that when we talk about accountability. I just want to highlight that in all of these circumstances, though, there is a history of these people saying anti-Semitic things or engaging with anti-Semitic material. In the vein of Kyrie Irving, he has a few different tweets historically that are reflecting some Hebrew Israelite ideology that's pretty anti-Semitic. And even before he shared this movie trailer, he shared an Alex Jones video in October where Alex Jones is raving about the New World Order. But like we talked about last week in our anti-Semitic tropes conversation, New World Order is code for this secret clan of Jews who are ruling the world. So New World Order in and of itself is an anti-Semitic dog whistle. So he's already been sort of sprinkling that in. in regards to Kanye, I don't even know where I would begin to start with everything that Kanye's have said in the last 2 months. A lot of it was, again, under the vein of the Black Hebrew Israelite movement. Again, there is so much nuance to this conversation because the media is calling out specifically 3 Black men who are being anti-Semitic. What does it mean for that to be the focus versus the tons of white nationalists who are anti-Semitic? There's a conversation to be had there, but both conversations can exist. Anyway, I'm not going to go through all the ways in which Kanye West was recently anti-Semitic, but similarly to, God, there's just so, sorry, I'm looking at the article that we have sourced and I'm like, it's so bad. Similarly to with Kyrie, maybe a bit more extreme, Kanye has a history of being anti-Semitic. One of the lines that always has stood out to me is, I think it's in Flashing Lights, and every time I hear it, I'm always like, why did he say that? And I feel like no one picks up on it. But he's talking about the paparazzi, and he says basically that he hates the paparazzi more than the Nazis. And every time I hear that, I'm like, that was bold. And now, in light of all these other sources being like, yeah, this man like is pretty into Adolf Hitler and has made various pro-Hitler, pro-Nazi remarks in the past, I'm like, okay, this makes sense now. But yeah, this is not coming from like a new place. And I think it's important to highlight those things because if we were able to recognize certain anti Semitic dog whistles, maybe it could be clearer earlier on when people are being outwardly anti Semitic. Or also, I think it just points to the fact that people like to act like, oh, people can't get away with anti Semitism because the media is always going to call out anti-Semitism. But I don't think that that's true. I don't think that a lot of the time people who are being anti-Semitic are being called out for their anti-Semitism unless it reaches some sort of breaking point. But clearly there are plenty of celebrities who say and do a lot of anti-Semitic things who are not called out for it. So that's recent news.
Yeah, I'm actually glad we didn't include Dave Chappelle originally because I do think Dave Chappelle's comments are really different than Kyrie Irving and Kanye West, just in intention. But we could talk about that more maybe in a little bit. I'm not giving any context. I'm realizing that Dave Chappelle went on SNL and did his opening monologue, and it heavily featured on Kanye West's recent comments and poked fun at, is the kindest way I can say, the relationship between Black people and Jews in America. And some people were very upset. And so there's a lot to unpack there. But again, listen to On the Nose, The Jews, that episode, because they really break it down joke for joke at some point.
Okay, noted. I think we also are to talk more broadly about anti-Semitic remarks from other, I don't want to say celebrities, but well-known people that we admire. Because, I mean, for me, I'm a Nets fan. I used to be a Kyrie Irving fan. And so that was a bummer. And it always sucks when someone who, like, is, I mean, Kanye was already on his downfall. So that was sort of just like, whatever. But I feel like there are people who we maybe resonate more with who have made comments that are anti-Semitic that I think are much lesser known. One that immediately came to mind for me when me and Jesse were talking about this was Alice Walker. For those of you who don't know Alice Walker, first of all, I have a lot of questions. But second of all, author of The Color Purple and coined the term womanist, has long been beloved as an activist and incredible author. But she, very similarly to what we were just talking about, has had a history of bringing up a lot of different anti-Semitic tropes that sort of went under the radar for a while. Most recently was in 2018 when she basically, like, in a New York Times article, shouted out a pretty famously known Holocaust denier and anti-Semite, David Icke, I don't even know how to say his name. And she sort of doubled down on that too when she was questioned about it and was like, he's not anti-Semitic and I support his right to share his thoughts, basically. Ick also claimed that he and the book are not anti-Semitic. The book features a lot of stuff around like Jewish lizard people who are shape-shifting, blood-drinking, child-sacrificing Satanists, which again, all of this, as we talked about last time, all of this is anti-Semitic dog whistles. So it's pretty evidently anti-Semitic, but again, as the case is with a lot of these things, it can be easy to mask that when you're like, oh, well, I'm not explicitly saying fuck all Jews, I hate them. I just said that there might be a group of people who run the world and drink people's blood. And so it can be easy to sort of be like, well, but if we use that reasoning with any other oppressed group, it would be like, no, of course not. That's ridiculous. These are clear, like, tropes. So that is her main show of anti-Semitism. But if you go back through some of her older work, it gets a little weirder. And what I will say is part of what she's been called anti-Semitic for is criticizing Israel, which, as we know, is not anti-Semitic. So in that vein,
yeah, it gets messy.
yeah. But if it was just that, it would be like, okay, people are calling her anti-Semitic, but she's actually just anti-Zionist. But she uses a lot of Talmud text to talk about Israel and then talks about it in a way that links Israel and Jews. So talks about, she had wrote a poem where she says, are Goyim meant to be slaves of Jews, and not only that, but to enjoy it, and talks about young children being sexually assaulted, again with this child sacrifice thing. So I don't know. It gets very weird and yeah, pretty clearly anti-Semitic. And Jesse told me about Julian Assange, which I didn't know.
Yeah, I didn't either. Basically buying into the whole Jews run the media trope in some conversations, you know, about who has the power and who's controlling the narrative. I think he was upset that someone was linking him to a Holocaust denier because he said it was the Jews trying to bring him down because they knew that if they linked him to the Holocaust denier, everyone would be mad at him. And I don't know. It's not a stretch, but super disappointing that Julian Assange would, I guess, openly link power in America to Jews, which is another trope that we talked about last episode. I think it was surprising just because he's beloved on the left for the WikiLeaks connection. And I think, yeah, it was surprising to me. But also other people that I casually forgot about their anti-Semitism. I don't know if Tila Tequila matters to anybody else, but I mean, it's like a millennial status. I don't know if Gen Z even knows who she is, but I just forgot how she has an obsession with Hitler and loves Hitler and dressed her baby up like Hitler once or something, and very openly Nazi loving, which was bizarre. Miley Cyrus made a weird comment once about those old Jewish producers in the industry or something. Mel Gibson, obviously. I think that we should not skip over Donald Trump because Rebecca Pierce says really eloquently on the podcast that I've been referencing for 15 minutes now on the nose that, you know, we're skipping over sometimes Donald Trump's blatant anti-Semitism all the time. And there's so many documented moments, but especially when Donald Trump said that evangelical Christians are more grateful to him than Jews are about his work in Israel.
Which makes perfect fucking sense because, as we know, evangelical Christians are the people who want the existence of Israel more than anyone else. So it's like, thank you for word just putting it all on the table.
Yeah. I think the implication was that Jews should be grateful because it is, quote unquote, our country, Israel. We should be grateful that he's supporting it, and that just once again plays into the trope that Jews are outsiders and that we're always loyal to a different nation and just lying in wait, waiting to betray all our neighbors. So I just felt that we had to highlight that, even though there's a million other problematic white politicians who have relied on anti-Semitism at some point.
Yeah, I also think that one's important because I feel like a lot of Jews have used Donald Trump's support of Israel as justification for supporting him or as proof that he is good for Jewish people. But it's like, this man is so anti Semitic and he has said so many things that are blatantly anti Semitic. And so, again, when people are like, Donald Trump is good for Jews, what they mean is Donald Trump is good for Zionists, and Jews and Zionists are not synonymous. Also, other examples include half of any like musician in the hip hop world. I feel like lyrics for a really long time in hip hop reflect some anti Semitic tropes around Jews having power or money, and it's often thrown around as a way to refer to someone who has money or talk about control in the media. So I feel like whenever I'm listening to hip hop, I'm always like, oh, clocking small little anti Semitic things. And again, I think a lot of this is just coming from lack of knowledge and lack of understanding that these things aren't chill to say and are harmful.
Absolutely. I think it's a really good pathway into our next question about what does it feel like when we experience anti-Semitism and how we engage with it. Because I think what you're saying about clocking moments of anti-Semitic things popping up and just kind of rolling with it, or putting it in your brain and saving it for later, is 100% how I've always dealt with anti-Semitism. Is initially just minimizing it and trying to shrink it down to something that was not important or was a mistake or someone didn't mean it or it must have not been the way that I thought I perceived it, and kind of gaslighting myself into being like, get over it. And then discrediting my own feelings if I'm like, oh, that kind of made me feel weird, being like, oh my God, relax. You're just making such a big deal out of this. This is nothing. And convincing myself that it's funny or I can find a way to work around it with humor, and then pushing it off. And later, and I don't even know how much later, I then return to either Jewish content or Jewish community, and I can slowly start unpacking that in that space, because then I'm like, oh yeah, all these other people would be offended by that too, right? And kind of checking it out with the people in my community. But definitely have a push it down, shrink it, it's not that big of a deal reaction to almost all the anti-Semitism that I have experienced in my life. But I don't know. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like within the context of experiencing it from peers or outside forces, especially when it's not directed towards me, because I think the experience of dealing with overt anti Semitism directed towards you is very different than what we're talking about. A lot of, oh, that was anti Semitic, but we're moving on because it's not that big of a deal. I feel like but it's not that big of a deal is a big phrase that I tell myself with anti Semitism or have previously. I also think I do a lot of like questioning myself and being like, am I allowed to feel this way about
Mm.
this? Or having to bring it to my friends and be like, this happened. That's bad, right? That's not cool, right? And have someone else justify to me that it's not cool, especially someone who's not Jewish justify to me that it's not cool and okay to not be feeling good about it. And in that way, I think it's hard because I think with a lot of other forms of oppression, I am pretty vocal and opinionated. And so when it comes to anti Semitism, what I want to do is talk about it and be like, this is fucked up. But I feel this blockage where I have to caveat it with other things and be like, this is anti Semitic, but also let's make sure we're not forgetting how anti Black racism functions, or let's make sure we're not forgetting that we can't link Judaism to Zionism. And I can't just be upset about something being simply anti Semitic without having to introduce all of these other layers to it. And also
Yeah.
worrying about other people bringing those layers in, because I think where that need to make caveats comes from is other people pushing back and starting to play oppression Olympics, which I think happens a lot with I mean, it happens with everything, but it happens a lot with anti Semitism. If you go into the comments on any post talking about anti-Semitism, and it's like, okay, but dot dot dot. Can we just all feel how we feel about anti-Semitism for a second before we make it about something else?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think in recent years, I've started dealing with it more and telling myself it's okay to be upset about it and trying to push myself to not make caveats and surrounding myself with other Jewish people who are feeling similarly and who I know have similar politics to me, so I don't have to worry about caveating things and being like, okay, but I'm not a Zionist, and so I don't want this to be a conversation about Israel because that doesn't resonate with me. So yeah, I think as I'm getting older, I'm learning how to engage more and more.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting too. I didn't realize when I was typing up notes and stuff, but you and I are in really different fields right now too, and working in the Jewish world every day. I feel that I have almost so many conversations about anti-Semitism
Mm.
and Jewish pride and all of these things that sometimes I forget how it was before I was working in the Jewish world all the time. And there are a lot of things we could say about working in the Jewish world, but in some ways I have taken that community for granted now, being like, oh yeah, I can talk about it with anybody at work and I don't have to worry about someone minimizing it or saying that wasn't a big deal, which is new and special and unique and weird that this is a place that you can work in and spend most of your time in. So I think that is definitely shaping my perspective recently, especially around the anti-Semitic stuff that's been going on.
Yeah, I think coming at it from non-Jewish field, my day-to-day is not super Jewish. And frankly, outside of the Jewish community that I've created through making mensches and hosting Shabbats, my community isn't super Jewish. So yeah, it often feels very weird for those reasons because I feel like people get unsure about how to engage with it.
Yeah.
Which is something we're going to talk about in a bit. We
Mm-hmm.
also want to talk about how it feels for our non-Jewish peers to just simply support people who are anti-Semitic, because as we know, in the context of general oppression, even if you're not saying something that is oppressive, if you are supporting someone or defending someone who is saying something oppressive, you are also doing harm. So yeah, what does that look like for us?
You know, I was thinking about this too, but you know that vibe you get when you just like, I don't want to bring up my weird Jewish shit here because it's not that it's weird. I know it's not weird. I love being Jewish and I want to talk about this, but it would be weird in this context or it'd be weird with these people. That's how I know that people are just casually anti-Semitic, you know? Because you
Yes,
get
yes,
that
yes, yes,
vibe
yes,
and you're like,
yes.
this doesn't feel good. I feel like it would be weird to say the word Shabbat in this room. Those are the moments where I'm like, oh, I'm picking up on this inherent anti-Semitism that, as we've talked about before, is so deep in our culture. Of course, as Americans, people pick it up like we pick up our racism, like we pick up everything else. But
Yeah,
there's
100%.
there's just that, yeah, I don't know how to explain that feeling where you just kind of know that everyone's going to be like, oh, okay, or like, what's that? Or you just get that vibe,
Yeah.
and that's the most basic way that people, the same people would be like, oh, I'm not anti-Semitic. I would never say anything, you know, but you just, ooh, I don't know, you feel it, and I didn't know how to write that down, but I think, yeah, I don't know how to confront that with my friends because they're not saying it openly, but I just know it's there.
Yeah, no, I feel like that's a very common experience, and I definitely completely understood what you're talking about as soon as you said it. Yeah, I mean, I feel like this is almost a reflection of the first question because if someone is supporting an anti-Semite, then my read of that is that you're also anti-Semitic, but I think it can be hard because, again, so many anti-Semitic tropes are masked in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And especially recently, a lot of people who have been anti Semitic are also Black. And so it gets into this very layered conversation around race and racism and racial politics as well that can feel really complex.
Yeah, I think that's a great point about this visibility of criticizing and critiquing and naming and shaming anti-Semitism that's been happening right now. People have pointed this out in much more articulate ways that I'm about to summarize, but Kanye didn't lose the Adidas deal over all the anti-Black shit he said, and Kyrie's other conspiracy theories weren't harmful, but this one is, and just the ways that certain communities are allowed to be discriminated against publicly in the media, and we're okay with it, but when it comes to Jews, then all of a sudden it's a problem. It's like this perception, right, that this was the result. But Rebecca Pierce says it on the news, America gets off on punishing Black people for shit that everyone else is doing, is super accurate. We, as an American, white Americans, love to punish Black people for doing something. And so to believe that the average white Christian American cares so much about anti-Semitism and ending it, that they're willing to talk about all these Black people, it's just not true. There's no way that the average white Christian American is invested in ending anti-Semitism through shaming Kanye online. That's not how it works. So I think we need to interrogate, it's great that our friends aren't openly saying anti-Semitic shit, but also when they are criticizing anti-Semitism in the way that it is out in the media, who are they criticizing and why? And what is that really saying about the conversation about anti-Semitism, rather than assuming that, oh, great, they're talking shit about Kyrie now, that must mean that they care about ending anti-Semitism. I don't know. I think it's an important racial dynamic that we can name.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's also a cyclical nature of anti-Semitism in a lot of European Christian-based anti-Semitism, that Jews have to have some power in order to be criticized for having power, and then knocked down a peg and then expelled or resettled. This history of anti-Semitism. So I think that contributes to the feeling of, well, I don't know if I can criticize this person for saying an anti-Semitic thing, because it is true that we do have some power here, or it is true that this is a history of something, because it's a phenomena throughout history that Jews have had power and then it's been taken away, or they've been attacked, they've had to pay for it. So I think that is playing out through all of our feelings that we're sharing here too.
Yeah, and I also think that, again, when we start to have these conversations, people are largely talking about Jews. Again, we're getting into this Ashken normativity. People are talking about Jews as white people, and people are talking about white Jews specifically, but they're not actually talking about Jews in the way that Jews exist, which is multiracial, multi-ethnic. There are, again, as we've said a million times, are Jews from all different racial backgrounds, all different ethnic backgrounds. However, though, when we're talking about anti-Semitism and when we start having these conversations, people are talking about specifically white Jews. And that, again, contributes to the erasure of Jews of color in this massive way, because then they're being confronted with both being erased from Judaism by non-Jews and Jews alike, and also facing oppression for their other identities. So just wanted to highlight that.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point. It's the homogenization that people want from the Jewish community to make it easier, but it's not accurate at all.
How do we prioritize our feelings around anti-Semitism without making caveats for our anti-Zionism or caveats about other forms of oppression? Well, obviously I wrote this question because I already started talking about this earlier. But
good. Yeah, can you start us off, because I'm struggling with it? So
yeah, I mean, I feel like part of why I even included this question is we just need to start having this conversation, because honestly, I don't know. It's been really difficult, and it feels like it's nearly impossible to just feel hurt and scared and angry about anti-Semitism without being like, okay, but I want to make sure that we're also talking about anti-Zionism, and that people know I'm coming from a place of anti-Zionism, and that I'm prioritizing Palestinian liberation, and that I am acknowledging the ways that this conversation is also really anti-Black. And my brain just starts like cycling, and I'm like, okay, I don't even know how to just feel angry or sad about this without jumping into this hamster wheel.
Yeah.
I don't have an answer for that. I've been trying to be really intentional in when I post and reminding myself not to make caveats. And in my own thought processes, just reminding myself it's valid and okay to just feel hurt about anti-Semitism. Full stop.
Yeah.
Full stop. I don't need to say anything else. It can just be that.
Yeah. I'm not there yet, I think. And I am really grateful for you posting about it and talking about it and naming it, because I am not able to separate it, I think, as easily or even really at all. I'm reflecting on the fact that I think my understanding of anti-Semitism that has been perpetrated against me has been so weaponized by organizations and institutions that wanted to direct me in a certain way, either to Israel or to giving money somewhere or to Holocaust remembrance, that I don't know if I ever had a moment growing up where I was allowed to sit in anti-Semitism and feel it and process it and not do something about it. And I think that's a really weird way that Jewish education has weaponized, monetized, whatever, kind of politicized feeling discriminated against, because they want us to do something about it. They want us to go have Jewish babies, or they want us to go out and work in Jewish professions, or they want us to do something in the community. And I don't know if the Jewish community as a whole has really sat and felt feelings. And obviously I'm very shaped by the ADL's response and kind of management of the whole Kyrie Irving situation, which is so infuriating, because the ADL, as we've talked about, is not the source for understanding anti-Semitism at all. They're super problematic and they take shots at all different types of organizers, and we should not support them. But somehow they keep getting, like, they keep picking up the phone every time anti-Semitism comes out, and it's just so frustrating to watch this be the voice of experiencing anti-Semitism in the United States. I watched Jonathan Greenblatt try to explain how threatened and scared he feels by Kyrie Irving's comments, and I just called bullshit a little bit. I'm threatened and scared by fucking neo-Nazis hanging the Kanye is right over the nameless white, could be anybody, neo-Nazis hanging out in upstate New York that are probably talking shit right now and hanging out planning things. That scares me a whole fuck ton more than a few comments that Kyrie Irving made. And I don't understand why they get to be the voice of Jews in America. But a great quote that Sam Adler-Bell said on the same podcast I'm referencing all the time, just go listen to it, is that the ADL's investment in Jewish victimhood is not an innocent investment. So, like, when the gatekeepers of Jewish victimhood are people who are invested in it for the sake of absolving Israel from killing Palestinians, then my investment in Jewish victimhood makes me feel so fucked up. Like, I don't want Jewish victimhood. And that summarized it really well for me too, that I'm always trying to interrogate these stop anti-Semitism posts or these anti-Semitism on college campuses accounts, because I don't want that victimhood if it is tied to the oppression of another people. And it's really hard for me to separate that out in our current society. So that's why I'm so conflicted, because I can't separate it right now, because it has never been separated for me, or I've never been able to see a model of that, I think, in our community.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is what makes us have this incessant need to make caveats, because every instance of anti-Semitism is reacted to by all of these Zionist Jewish organizations that have made a name for themselves in America. I feel like every single article that I read about the recent anti-Semitism cites the fucking ADL. And I'm like, okay, as soon as I see that, I'm like, this is also not a space for me, because the ADL is incredibly Zionist and not the source for anti-Semitism. And so this goes into accountability, and it's like, when the way that Kyrie Irving was asked to take accountability was through working with the ADL and also pledging to donate $500,000, quote, towards causes and organizations that work to eradicate hate and intolerance in our communities, which is so incredibly vague and also is not even focusing on anti-Semitism. So I'm not even really sure. That could be going anywhere, which great cause, but can we get a little bit more specific about that?
Mm-hmm.
But as soon as it said part of his accountability process was to work with the ADL, I was like, well, I don't want that. Nothing about that is saying accountability to me. And if my brain's history is accurate, Kyrie has been pretty vocally pro-Palestinian, which is something that I, like, previous to a lot of his other conspiracy stuff, really respected about him. And so it's just such a show. Like, it's just like, okay, this is what we have to do because I did something that people are upset about. And then also the ADL rejecting the donation. So then, is that what working with the ADL meant, was just putting the donation towards the ADL, which, again, it does not need any more financial support. And B,
Mm-hmm.
I don't want financial support in addressing anti-Semitism to be going to a Zionist organization. So that's not accountability for me, a Jewish person.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean, there was a lot in the article that is in our source about Kyrie that just talks about him not actually saying, just, I'm sorry for this. And it was very much being sort of forced into making a statement so that because he was suspended without pay, which is also like, okay, suspended without pay. You're still on the team. You're going to get reinstated. You make enough money that being suspended without pay is not that big of a deal. But he basically was just forced into apologizing so that he could continue his life as is. And even that being said, his forced apology that's not accountability to me.
Yeah.
With that being said, what does accountability look like?
Yeah, I feel like specifically with the Kyrie thing, the biggest issue was him not saying, I didn't realize that's what I was promoting, or I never would have said that if that's what I thought this was going to turn out like. It was this defensiveness and this getting stuck in it and saying, I will not take back what I'm saying, and what I think played out with Kanye and what has played out with Dave Chappelle on so many issues, especially after the trans comments that he made during his, I don't even know how many stand-ups ago, because he keeps getting stand-up gigs after saying the most horrific shit ever. Yeah. Is the refusal to apologize and digging deeper into your defensiveness because that will somehow make it right. If you can just convince enough people that you know what you're saying and it wasn't like that. It's kind of the only way that people have been responding. And I think the accountability comes in with admitting we didn't know, admitting that we didn't intend it that way. And then for people who are serial repeaters of anti-Semitism, owning that and interrogating your defensiveness and saying, wow, okay, maybe I am anti-Semitic and maybe I have really held these beliefs. Didn't realize that until right now. Instead of just assuming we're going to all be absolved as good people if we just keep digging down and staying in our core beliefs. I think it's pretty strange that we can't have a conversation where we admit that we don't know things as a society. So those were some that I think are important. And of course, education. I don't even know, though, education. Education is so political in the Jewish world, too, that I don't know how that shows up for people. But I think it's key that the accountability looks different for those with power and influence than our friends, right? I don't expect my friends to I would hope my friends would not make a donation to the ADL after saying something anti-Semitic. That is not how accountability looks. And I think what I'm saying with, I didn't know that, or I didn't realize what I was repeating, or I wouldn't have said that if I knew that connection historically. It's something I'd like to hear a lot more from people in my life who have said vaguely, maybe repeated a conspiracy theory here or there type anti-Semitic stuff. And I don't know what it looks like for those with power and influence, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think like a lot of what we see in regards to Kanye losing all of these big fashion deals is a start. Part of me is like, I don't want to discount the fact that that is part of the answer. Although, and here I am caveating, he should have lost those deals when he was expressing tons of misogynoir. So again, I don't know, why was it only revoked when anti-Semitism came up? A different conversation. And on top of that, why was he even granted all of these deals in the first place if he has this history of anti-Semitism and tons of misogynoir? So yeah, I think it is really difficult because who are we allowing to, I mean, not to go on an anti-capitalist rant, but again, even farther than that, why are people making millions and billions of dollars in the first place? Should anyone be awarded a deal like that? But that's an aside. It's just, if we are going to be living in a capitalist world where people are getting billion-dollar fashion deals, maybe not people who are known anti-Semites or known racists. And yeah, if it's apologies, I think matter no matter who they're coming from, whether it's someone with power and money versus your average Joe. But I think what's so important about an actual apology, like we were talking about, is even beyond uttering the words, I'm sorry. I think it's Mia Mingus who talks about the 4 parts of accountability and giving a genuine apology. I'm going to put that in our sources, but she talks about how the steps of that are self-reflection, apology, repair, and change behavior. And she says, true accountability is not only apologizing, understanding the impact your actions have caused on yourself and others, making amends or reparations to the harmed parties, but most importantly, true accountability is changing your behavior so that harm, violence, abuse does not happen again. And I think that that's really where we start to get to the core of how to practice accountability and how I would want to see accountability from anyone who's done or said something anti-Semitic, where it's like, let me like understand why this is harmful and what the impacts are. Or even if I can't understand, just understand what the impacts are. Apologize, actually apologize, repair in however you can, whether that be through monetary reparations or working within the community, and then literally changing your behavior, not repeating the same behavior that led you to this moment in the first place, which is something that we see with the 2 examples we've been talking about most of this session, where these people have repeated this behavior over and over and over again. There has never been one point in time in which they've actually like taken accountability to the point that they have changed behavior and therefore completed this apology cycle. And I think what you said really is important and resonates around feeling like we have to get comfortable feeling uncomfortable. I think that we talk about this a lot when we're talking about reckoning with racism and the fact that as white people in the United States, we have to acknowledge that we are all complicit and we are all racist. And what we are working towards when we talk about anti-racism is like exactly what we just talked about with accountability, is understanding, repairing harm, apologizing, and like changing behavior. And that's uncomfortable. It's really uncomfortable to be like, I did something that was not okay and was harmful, and I have to own up to that, repair that harm, apologize for that, and not do it again. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about accountability to or for anti-Semitism. And yeah, that's what I would want from the people around me, and that's also what I would want for the people who have way more power and influence than the people around me have.
Yeah. I love that framework that you introduced, the 4 components. And I think this is essential for movement building, right? And for coalition building. And that's, I love this quote from Jay Fredge from their Understanding Antisemitism, that we stay in relationship with other communities so that we can agitate and change each other with love. And that goes back to everything that we've talked about when we started Making Mensches around anti-racism and keeping in community and not leaving community just when we're frustrated, but holding each other close to agitate one another and to change one another and interrogate our shared identities and our not shared identities. And I think this is a huge part of Joyous Justice's podcast. They've just rebranded, I think they're Joyous Justice now instead of what they used to be, but just had a great episode about false urgency in movement building and the impact of building slow, deep, and irreversible movements, and how we have to be careful for all movements not to fall into this false urgency of the sky is falling panic that people developed around this Kanye West, Kyrie Irving, Dave Chappelle, the rise of anti-Semitism fear.
Mm-hmm.
But there is an urgency in the rise of anti-Semitism. It's slower than the past 2 months. It's been building for a long time. But if we're ever going to effectively develop ways to fight that, it's through being in community and coalitions with other people of other identities. We Jews alone do not fight anti-Semitism. We have to build coalitions with others. And just like we say with all other forms of oppression, it's through this movement building that is slow and irreversible rather than these, flash in the pan, is that the expression? Like campaigns or social media posts. So I think it's a good reminder that we've got work to do as Jews to stay in community with others, and
Mm-hmm.
other communities have work to do to stay in community with us and to work through that.
And all of that can exist outside of Zionism and should exist outside of Zionism because that's not the same as Judaism. We were going to talk about calling people in and out. I guess we can still, but I think the answer, we'll get into it briefly because what do you do when someone that you are close to, or even not close to, but in the same space as, says or does something anti-Semitic? What do you do if not just ignore it and feel uncomfortable about it and wish you had said something? Or not go back to that space because you're uncomfortable. Calling people in and out is not a binary. There's not one that is good and one that is bad. There are different tools that exist in your toolkit that you can use at different times. And it really depends on the circumstances which one you want to use in that moment. If you've had a really tough day or someone has said a few different anti-Semitic remarks and still won't stop, maybe we use calling out, which is like literally calling someone out in whatever the setting is and being like, hey, I've asked you multiple times to stop saying that. You're being really anti-Semitic right now. And not caring about what the setting is because that either that's what you have in your toolkit at the moment or this person has already been called in and that hasn't been effective. Calling people in looks a lot like trying to hold someone accountable. It's a step of holding someone accountable, and it's a matter of having a conversation with someone gently, making sure they're in a space to receive what you're telling them. So not in the group of people that you're in, but maybe pulling them aside or asking if you can have a conversation over the phone later, and identifying the specific behavior or thing that they said that was anti-Semitic and explaining why. Even if you don't want to explain why, sending them resources on why and being like, hey, like when you said insert phrase here, that's actually rooted in a lot of anti-Semitic ideologies. Here is some research on them that you can read more about, or let me tell you about them. And that was really hurtful to me. And I just wanted to express to you that I'm feeling that way because I really like being in community with you and I want to feel comfortable with that. So also acknowledging why you care enough to call that person in and how you want your relationship to look moving forward. All of these are elements of calling someone in. And just being very specific about behavior, not just being like, hey, you're being anti-Semitic, because no one's going to respond well to that. And that's automatically going to put people in the defense. And we want to be clear about what it is that someone has said or done that was harmful. This can be a big burden to take on as a Jewish person being confronted with anti-Semitism. This can also be something that you encourage your non-Jewish friends who are also in the space to do. It doesn't have to be you who's doing calling in or calling out. This is something that you should be encouraging your non-Jewish friends to be engaging in. If you need more information on how to call people in or call people out when they say something that's harmful, there are at this point literally tons of resources online around this. What I can recommend is Center for Anti-Violence Education because I am a per diem instructor with them and I facilitate workshops on this all the time, and they have ones every month that are free to the public. So if you want like a more comprehensive moment into how to actually engage with calling in, I would recommend Center for Anti-Violence Education and their free workshops, but you can also look it up and there are plenty of resources online. That was jam-packed.
That was amazing. Thank you for those resources, though, and for walking us through that, because I think it's really important that we give some actionable things you could do tomorrow if you confront anti-Semitism in your workplace or on the street at home. So, thank you.
And also be gentle with yourself. If you are like, okay, next time I hear something, I'm going to say something, and then you can't in the moment or something happens in the moment, you're going to have another opportunity. We live in a world that is ripe with all different forms of oppression, and I promise you there will be another chance for you to call someone in for doing something. And also practice self-reflection. If you're not a Jewish person, think about some of the language that you use or some of the phrases that you've normalized, and take them out of the rotation. And if you are Jewish, we see you, we hear you. Anti-Semitism is heavy and real, and you're allowed to feel sad and hurt and angry about it. That's all. Full stop. You're allowed to feel those things about it.
Yeah.
We'll be back in 2 weeks for the third installment of the series, when we're going to talk about Jewish generational trauma, the Holocaust, and beyond, because Jewish generational trauma exists outside of the Holocaust, and I think that's the only narrative that we often hear about. So join us then to talk about how anti-Semitism really can sit in our bodies.
Yes, that too.
Shout out to Nate for our podcast music. And as usual, sign up for our newsletter. There's a link in our Instagram bio and on our website, because if you're signed up for our newsletter, our sources get sent out there. There's also a link to our sources in our bio, but the newsletter is really cute and Jesse works hard on it, and it's just a good way to get the sources. So thanks for being here with us, and we can't wait to see you on December 14th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time.
Thanks, Alana.
Bye.
Bye.